Hi there, I'm Ethan Mills, and I want to talk to you a little bit today about hermeneutics, specifically context in hermeneutics. Now, when we talk about context, sometimes that can be an overwhelming kind of concept or idea. But I just want to teach a little bit on what that actually looks like at a very base level, because context helps determine meaning in Scripture. How many times have we heard somebody teach or preach or share a scripture completely out of context? You hear it and something in your spirit or your mind is like, I don't think that is exactly what you're trying to get across. And so when we look at context, context is something bigger than ourselves. It's bigger than one verse, but it helps us understand and grasp what God is trying to speak through Scripture. Context has two very critical pieces that we need to look at. The first one is this: surrounding context. What is surrounding context? Well, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's context that surrounds a scripture verse. Let's look at one. Philippians 4:13. I'm sure you've heard it. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Now that scripture can easily be taken out of context, and I'm pretty sure I've probably taken it out of context once. You've probably heard or seen somebody. Before we get a real grasp of what this verse is saying, it's kind of easy to. Does that mean that I can go outside of this building right now and run a mile with no coat on in negative 14-degree weather, and I'll be fine at the end because Christ gives me strength? Probably not. Does that mean that he is going to give me strength and help in my daily walk with him? Yeah, probably. When we look at context, there are more important things than just exactly what this verse says and what we can manipulate or kind of work or squeeze out. Imagine looking at it like a target. So let's start with the middle piece, right? The passage itself, the first verse. There you go. You have it in all of its splendor and glory, that one verse. But maybe it's a little misguided in our own mind because we don't look at it the correct way. Well, how do we look at surrounding context? Well, then we expand the target. It's no longer just the passage. Now we look at the immediate context. What are some verses surrounding it? What is happening here? In the book of Philippians, Paul is writing to the church of Philippi. So what is he saying around this? Well, it's surrounded by context of understanding that he knows what it's like to be in want and know how to have plenty. He talks about generosity. And all of a sudden, it's not just about doing whatever we want and God backing us up. We get a bit more context. Now, we can go a little bit farther than that. The next ring of that target is the larger section. Now in our English Bibles, it's a little bit easier because it's broken up into segments. You know what I'm talking about, those bold letter sections. So why don't we expand it a little bit further? What is Paul saying here? What is God saying through this letter to try to bring us closer to him and be more like him? Instead of just a couple verses before and after, maybe it's a whole paragraph. Maybe it's a lot of verses, depending on the size of the chapter. Well, then let's go a little bit further, shall we? Let's expand that target and let's look at the rest of the book. You know, sometimes it's easy, like Philippians. Sometimes it's difficult, like Psalms. But let's look at the overarching theme. What is Paul trying to say to the church of Philippi? What is Jesus speaking through him and saying, this is what I want you to know? And all of a sudden, context begins to open up in our eyes. Oh, okay, maybe I was wrong because my ideas don't line up with Scripture, but Scripture is lining up with Scripture, as it tends to do when we open our eyes a little further. And then even beyond that, is this fitting in with the overarching theme of the Bible? Does this fit in with what God has been saying through all of time and creation? And it just because we begin to find things that our ideas of this scripture don't begin to line up, doesn't mean that we've messed up. It means that God is revealing through context. Context is important. The second thing is literary genre. I don't know about you, I love to read. I read everything. I'll read fiction and nonfiction. I read self-help. I read, the Christian Guides to Book. I read commentaries and textbooks sometimes when it's required of me. But I love to read all different types of books. Now, let me ask you, if you had an entire library shelf filled with all these different styles of books, would you read all of them the same way? Well, guess what? It's the same thing with Scripture. Just because it's all in the Bible doesn't mean all the writing styles are exactly the same. Is Psalms the same as Revelation? Absolutely not. Is John the same as Genesis? No. Is Leviticus the same as Philippians? No. And how do we know? Because of literary styles. You have genres like narratives, which is history and parables and biography. You have poetry, which comes in the form of songs, wisdom, and prophecy, Song of Solomon's and Psalms. You have discourse such as laws and wisdom and letters and epistles. Read them differently. We have to know what is being said and how it's being said. Jesus didn't say things in the same way that David did. Abraham didn't say the same things in the same way that Paul did. We have to take a step back and look at them and say, what is trying to be conveyed? Is it an emotion? Is it an attitude? Or is it a law? Is it a decree? Context is beautiful. It's amazing. It helps us look deeper as to what God is trying to say so we, on our end, don't mess it up. Now, it's much deeper than that, but we'll get into that at a later date. Thanks for letting me teach you. I'll see you later.